Hello, Rock That Doesn't Roll listeners. I'm Leah, and Andrew and I are really excited to share an episode from a podcast called No Small Endeavor, produced by PRX and Great Feeling Studios. And No Small Endeavor explores a really core question: what does it mean to live a good life? And the podcast includes a lot of really extraordinary guests, people that Rock That Doesn't Roll listeners will definitely recognize, like Queen of Christian Pop, Amy Grant, and also in really extraordinary figures like civil rights hero, Reverend James Lawson.
Yeah, but so we're going to bring you a episode of No Small Endeavor, so you can get a sample of it here on the Rock That Doesn't Roll feed. But we didn't bring you Amy Grant. We thought the specific episode that would edify our listeners the most is a conversation between the host of No Small Endeavor, award-winning theologian Lee C. Camp, talking with Kristin Dumais, author of Jesus and John Wayne, and David French. He's a political commentator and New York Times columnist. Together, they discuss politics, culture, and the need for hospitality in the digital age. And I thought it was a really good conversation. And, Leah, you know Dr. Dumais, right?
A little bit, and yeah. I really appreciate her work. And we just thought that if you drew a Venn diagram around the listeners of Rock That Doesn't Roll and the scholarship of Dr. Dumais, there'd be a lot of affinities.
Yes, a lot of overlap, I think. So without further ado, here's the full episode of No Small Endeavor.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor. Today, a special episode for you, not just because we have two guests, but also because they are two repeat and much acclaimed guests, Kristin Dumais and David French. Many of you know Kristin as the author of the New York Times bestseller Jesus and John Wayne. Some might summarize Kristin's work as a fierce lambasting of white male conservatism within American Christianity. And many of you know David French as, well, a white male conservative. And Kristin did come right out and say to David,
honestly, when you first invited me onto your podcast, I was like, okay, I don't know if I can trust this guy. I know things about him.
But I was more interested in hearing what they might agree on, which yielded a delightful conversation with a great deal of wisdom for how one might do the hard work of cultural commentary in a world suffused with anger and partisanship.
With the decline of traditional media and local media, everything's a competition for clicks.
You have to really screen, okay, what's the fringe thing that's just going to contribute to this endless churn of outrage versus what's the important thing that we actually need to focus on and be alarmed about.
They discuss their work as professing Christians, both publicly pushing back against the religious right and how they've dealt with the ridicule which their work has engendered.
Triggering a fight became kind of a business model. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to participate in that business model. I don't want to feed that.
All this coming right up. Kristin Dumais is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Go Domers. Research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She's also the New York Times bestselling author of Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And today in the studio, David French is an American political commentator, holds a law degree from Harvard Law, served previously as a fellow at the National Review Institute, where he also served as a staff writer for the National Review, currently serves as senior editor of The Dispatch and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. And both Kristin and David have joined us before, but never together. And I'm quite delighted to have you together here in person in the studio here in Nashville. Welcome to you both.
Well, thanks so much for hosting us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes, Kristin just rolled into Nashville.
Yes,
first time
today.
In 20-something years, you said.
It is. It is.
So. It's changed a lot since you were here last.
Yeah. It has.
It's a different city than 20 years ago. Well, I think when I knew Kristin was coming, I thought, I would love to hear Kristin and David talk some. And I think one of the reasons, the obvious reason is that you both write about a lot of the similar issues. But I think where I would like to start is at a more abstract level of similarity between you two, and that is that you both are confessionally Christian. You're both, as far as I know, would see yourselves, I presume, as Orthodox Christians. And for those of you listening, they're both nodding yes.
Small Orthodox.
Small
Right.
Orthodox, in the great classic Christian tradition sense. And yet you both are writing in such a way that you are doing hard-hitting, heavy critiques of the American practice of Christianity. And thus you are both getting sharp pushback from a lot of people in the American Christian world.
On occasion.
Yeah. And so
Like every day.
I thought this would be interesting to see how you two are experiencing that, and see kind of what kind of notes you might share, and what kind of things we could learn from you about how you're experiencing that. So I guess first let me ask this question in light of all that I just said. What these days are you seeing in light of the dynamic of you doing your critiques and the kind of pushback that you're getting? What's surfacing in the last 6 months or so for you as you're paying attention to the kind of pushback or things you're hearing? Kristin, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I get it quite as bad as David. I think there's probably a bit more of a sense of betrayal people feel on, whereas for me, I was largely unknown and then came out of nowhere and wrote Jesus and John Wayne. And so honestly, at first, the book did not meet a lot of pushback, mostly because I think people who didn't like it thought it was best to ignore it, and they were probably right. And then at a certain point, it became impossible to ignore. But what that meant is that I had several months of really just enthusiastic responses from evangelicals themselves. And so maybe it was about a year ago that the attacks started coming a bit more. And, I treated them, I'm a historian, and I'm very comfortable with scholarly engagement. And so these were not really scholarly critiques.
Right.
But I responded to them as though they were. And so I just kept clarifying, talking about evidence, talking about historical methodology. When they would ask me questions about my faith, I would answer honestly. And I thought there's something to be just modeled there, that you don't have to play games. You don't have to, meet fire with fire. And so that's what I've been trying to model. I will say things have gotten more vicious in the last 6 months or so.
I've noticed that.
I've got some theories. I'd like to hear David first give some of his theories and we can compare notes.
Yeah, I do think things have gotten more vicious across the board, and I've seen things get more vicious towards you in the last 6 months. It's funny. The way the algorithm works is once you've been lumped together with another person and enough times, you all of a sudden start seeing when they're under fire.
Yes.
It's kind of funny how that works, but I have noticed things getting more vicious. I would strongly recommend that anyone who's not done it yet read Tim Alberta's long extended piece in The Atlantic about the fracturing of the evangelical church. And there was a thought that after the Trump years, that some of the intensity, just the raw, primal, angry intensity of evangelical engagement would ease. And if anything, I think that the opposite has occurred. If anything, while there are many millions of evangelicals who've sort of seen what politics has become and they kind of pull back and they don't want anything to do with it, that would be a lot of my friends, for example, who are not terribly political. They've just pulled back. The real deep engagement in the culture war has intensified. And the interesting thing is it has intensified even as scandal after scandal has sort of blasted apart major Christian institutions. And I think those things are related. I think that when your own institutions are in a state of collapse, one of the ways that you respond is by rallying against the other, rallying against those on the outside who are seeking to do harm to these institutions. And so this should be a moment, in my view, of an enormous amount of repentance, enormous amount of reflection because you can't say that any single strand of evangelicalism has been left untouched. You go to the sort of Pentecostal mega church of Hillsong, to the Ravi Zacharias Christian Intellectual Apologetic, to the largest Protestant denomination in America, to the largest Christian camp in America, to the largest Christian university in America. And each one of these has been racked by massive scandal. And in a weird way, I think it's caused some folks to double down.
How does that fit your observations, Kristin?
Yeah, that does make sense. I think that, for me as a historian, this hasn't really caught me off guard because I wrote a book essentially on the abuse of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so I watched how these patterns have existed for generations now. And surface level, things looked more peaceful. But underneath, particularly when you start looking at, these are long histories of abuse,
Right?
Abuse of power, sexual abuse, cover-ups in these organizations, in these institutions. And so listening to survivors' stories over the years, I already had a pretty clear sense that there's some ugliness here and that exposing that doesn't make it go away.
Right.
And so, that... I'm caught between, on the one hand, being surprised to see it so blatant out in the open, and on the other hand, not surprised. What I do see happening now that I'm trying to figure out, I'm in the strange place, for me at least, as a historian, of being both participant and observer now. I'm more comfortable in the observer mode.
Right.
Usually my historical subjects have been dead, and so I just tell about them. And now they're interacting with me, and I've become a character in the story. So that's strange. But what I'm watching is this I'm always looking for networks, alliances. And I'm watching some interesting alliances here between conservative evangelicals, some of them, and more secular conservatives.
Extremely secular conservatives.
Extremely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's where some of this viciousness comes out, because in evangelical spaces, you can go so far and then you've got to kind of pull back.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now I'm seeing a lot of some conservative evangelicals kind of seem to cheer on from a safe distance some of this ruthless, more secular conservatism, as they are very clearly, it seems to be a strategy here, going after people like you, people like me, right? Orthodox Christians, faithful, practicing Christians in these spaces who are trying to hold our communities to account. And I think that does seem to be a very clear strategy.
If you have built a movement around the notion that we're fundamentally good guys, we're fundamentally good people, we're nice people, we're beset by bad people. So we're good people, not perfect. No Christian would say, even the most hardcore religious right person would say perfect. There's going to be bad apples in the orchard, but fundamentally good people being beset by really bad people. Well, and then when there are things that occur that can call into question that fundamental goodness of the movement, there's a couple of ways to go with that. One is to sort of say, my goodness, we have sinned, we have fallen short, and we need to repent of this. Another one is to say, well, no matter how bad we are, they're worse. And it seems to be people have walked through that door number two. No matter how bad we are, they're much worse. And so that's what I mean by the rally effect. And, we're talking about a movement. I just had lunch today with someone in the SBC, and we were talking about the upcoming convention and everything. And we're talking about a movement that there's a pretty strong argument has been the most toxic force in American politics and culture in the last few years. When you're talking about the near-death experience the American Republic had in the Stop the Steal effort, that was a heavily evangelical-driven effort. And there's no credible argument otherwise. If you're talking about the more than 250,000 unnecessary deaths of unvaccinated Americans, again, heavily white evangelical influenced. A lot of the resistance to prudent health. Now, I fully acknowledge that there are people who went too far on the safety side of things in the COVID era, but an enormous amount of the resistance to even common sense public health measures came from the evangelical community. If you're looking at things like mortal consequences of a movement, consequences to our democracy of a movement, a lawlessness within a movement, you're going to locate a lot in white evangelicalism right now. And it's a horrifying thing to contemplate if you sort of remove the log from your eye and stare clearly into the mirror. It's a horrible thing to contemplate. But if everyone else is worse, then you can kind of live with yourself.
So let me ask a question then. So David, you're pointing to one perhaps root cause that's leading to a lot of the fruit that we're seeing is this sort of demonization. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and thus the conflict. What other sorts of root causes would you all point to in what is now in early flower or full flower in American Christian culture?
I mean, that's core. And then you can kind of build out from that, right? We're the good guys, you're the bad guys. It's very pliable. And what we're talking about at its heart is, to use the ever popular phrase right now, white Christian nationalism. But I was just reading for research a book on Christian America. I won't mention the author right now. That'll be in my next book. But you're just steeped in this idea that America is God's special country, and America has been so richly, richly blessed by God, but only when we are obedient. And so there's this just extensive mythical notion of our original faithfulness in the colonial era, and really all the way up to the 1930s when the Marxists and the socialists and so started taking over, and then the hippies made it all worse. And now we're in this place, and if we want to restore God's blessings, we need to restore our faithfulness. And therefore, anybody who is deemed a threat or against us there, they have to be defeated for even their own good, for the good of the country. And this is, in this particular book, there is an explicit argument America is not a democracy, right? It's a constitutional republic. It's not a democracy. And what I came to see in my research more broadly is that all of these impulses of holding up authority, but not just government authority, only God-ordained authorities, right? So if God establishes, the presidency, or if God's will is done, then you owe obedience. If God's will is not done, then it is your duty to resist that authority, to overthrow that authority, right? And to restore God's order. And you can see where this goes. As I was researching this, I just kept thinking, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? Because this sure looks authoritarian here, deeply anti-democratic. And that is, in fact, what we're seeing. All the things David was talking about, the Stop the Steal, looking at voting rights, and just the rhetoric out there. It's almost apocalyptic, but it's always justified. The ends always justify the means here.
One thread I'd also pull on is the role of prophecy. And I think this is a very underappreciated reality, an underappreciated phenomenon in sort of the larger media. There were an awful lot of prophets, people who proclaimed to have prophetic giftings, who declared Donald Trump not just that, he's going to be president, but he has a special anointing upon his life, that there is a unique God-ordained purpose for him. And so therefore, the opposition to Donald Trump became not just a political disagreement, but a matter of a demonic assault on God's purposes. And you don't see this as much on Twitter because the prophecy world isn't on Twitter. You'll see it a lot more on Facebook. You'll see it a lot more in YouTube. You'll see it a lot in sermons or messages that are kind of forwarded around. But it is quite common. And I remember when I debated Eric Metaxas about support for Donald Trump, it was very clear to me very quickly that if not actually operating under the influence of explicit prophecies, he had adopted that prophetic mindset about Donald Trump. And so at that point, what do you debate,
Right. Yeah, because I'm sitting here thinking, I mean, that's a non-falsifiable truth
Correct.
claim, right?
Mhm.
And it seems like that trend of non-falsifiable truth claims seems to be very prevalent, even for those who are not claiming the gift of prophecy.
Correct.
They have a feeling that such and so is the case, and then it's like, how do you go about doing that? Do you see broader or deeper trends leading to this sort of ease of people making non-falsifiable truth claims in the American experience these days?
I again, to sort of circle back to the phenomenon we've seen with prophecy and these non-falsifiable truth claims. Part of it is a consequence of, and look, I have a kind of an interesting faith journey. I grew up Church of Christ, left the Church of Christ in law school, and joined the Assemblies of God. My wife became a Christian at Times Square Church, David Wilkerson's church in Times Square in New York, very Pentecostal. Spent a lot of years in Pentecostal world. You can even find an old profile of me in Charisma magazine before I became a PCA Presbyterian. So I call myself Presbycostal. So I am not at all dismissive of Pentecostalism.
Mm-hmm.
But there has been something that has occurred within Pentecostalism that combines prophecy with lack of accountability and a strong gravitation towards authority that is becoming particularly toxic. There's this phenomenon known as the New Apostolic Reformation, for example, which essentially says the office of prophet, just like pastor or elder, should be an office of the church. And they often can be very authoritarian, and they also can be very dominionist, that God is granting dominion to Christians over, there's this phrase called the 7 mountain mandate, the 7 mountains of culture. God is granting Christian dominion over those 7 mountains of culture. And
I'm not familiar with that 7 mountains thing. What are the 7 mountains?
I can't list them all off the top of my head.
Education, government,
culture,
like Hollywood kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's that's a fairly common, widespread.
So Paula White, who was Donald Trump's chief spiritual advisor, is a 7 mountain mandate Pentecostal believer. And, so that kind of dominionism, there are millions of people if you say 7 mountain mandate to them, they'd be like, what are you talking about? But it is the ideas of it, the concepts of it have really started to work their way through Pentecostal Christianity and leaking outside of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good way of describing it. And you're right, this prophecy tradition exists off the radar of certainly the secular media.
Yes.
But also, many Christians. So I grew up in the Reformed community, and, even as I was writing Jesus and John Wayne, I was thinking, an eye on that world. But man, do I have to watch all those videos to, it's not. But if you know where to look too, these books are not making the New York Times bestseller lists simply because the New York Times curates that list.
Right.
But if you go to Amazon, and I know this because my book gets grouped with some of these prophecy books regularly, and their sales put mine to shame, right? These just, I call them random prophecy books. I'm sure if you're in that world, you know more, who's who, but this is pervasive. And then the way that I like to see evangelicalism as many things, but one is a consumer culture. Evangelical consumers are very promiscuous, right? So we scholars tend to like to categorize. And so you've got the Baptists, and then you've got the Charismatics, you've got Pentecostalism. We can talk about Dominionism and 7 Mountains. But then on the receiving end, you have people who are reading their aunt's Facebook post that's direct out of, 7 Mountains, Dominionism. And then they're attending a Joyce Meyer seminar, and their pastor's preaching from, he just attended a John Piper conference, right? This is how that world works.
Yep.
And so we can kind of see there are many different sources, but what happens when they come together in this formulation? And then we're looking at, again, networks and alliances here. And so who is perceived, oh yeah, they're one of us. They're on our side. Even if they get a little crazy over there, they're one of ours.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to defend them, and their enemies are then our enemies too.
So let me ask this question. So David, you pointed a couple of times to this notion of you've kind of got door 1 and door 2 there. When you see this data before us, door 1 is leaning into repentance and longing for constructive change. Door 2 is denial and or minimization and seeing the other guy's worse.
Yeah.
And in both of your writing work, you've in effect chosen door 1 because you're taking the posture of critique, right?
Well, let me just be transparent. For me, because my goodness, I come out of the religious right. Like I ran the largest litigation team at the Alliance Defending Freedom, which was probably the largest Christian litigation team in America at the time when I was running it. And so for me, 2 things are happening at once. One is this kind of shock. Like, it's not that we were all in meetings in 2006 and 2007 going, character doesn't really matter. It's all the ends justify the means. No, we were in meetings in, the early 2000s and the mid 2000s and before that saying, man, character matters. And then all of a sudden, wait, I was there. I remember. And so part of it's shock. And then part of it for me is, quite frankly, I just have to confess, I was just wrong about some stuff. I was just wrong. So I don't want to posture myself as saying I'm on the outside critiquing those people. I want to say, look, I've walked with you guys through every second of the culture wars, through the moment when I started the first pro-life group at Harvard Law School back in 1991. And there are things that I missed or contributed to the problem, right? By focusing excessively on the left, or things that I missed and didn't understand about race, for example, until our lives changed and my family. So I don't want to position myself and say, I'm this guy who's sort of the dispassionate critique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's, I'm working through this with you, and this is what I see, and this is where I've been, and this is what I think we got wrong, and here's some of the things I think we got right. So I really, I don't want to place myself.
So what would you, thank you for that. So what would you say, let's say somebody's listening and they kind of find themselves being pulled between knowing whether they're going to lean towards door 1 or door 2.
Mm-hmm.
What sorts of things would you say, in what sorts of ways would you encourage, what sorts of considerations would you put out there to be considered that might help someone choose door 1 as opposed to battening down the hatches in door 2?
So here, I was speaking at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary a few weeks ago, and I was asked, what am I reading right now to sort of get me through this moment? And I gave like the most stereotypical evangelical answer ever, the Bible. But what I said was, but with this lens, I'm reading every single syllable of the New Testament, knowing that the of Christ and the followers of Christ had no power, and were confronting a world that was infinitely more hostile and persecuting of them than the world that we confront today. And if you read through that lens and you realize how much of Christ's words are directed to the people of God, calling them to repentance, how much Paul is writing to the early churches, and he's not giving them 6,000 word screeds against the most common Roman philosophies.
Right.
He's saying, turn to Jesus, and calling out the sin in these really small, persecuted, embattled churches, and saying, I'm hearing some bad stuff about you guys. You need to straighten up. Very little time is spent sort of saying, I know it's bad that, like a man is sleeping with his daughter-in-law, but
that's not as bad as.
Have you heard about the Romans? And so when you realize that there's actually precedent for the door number 1, and the precedent is set by Christ himself and by the early church, I feel like it makes door number 1 a lot more compelling.
Yeah, very helpful. Kristin, what about you?
Yeah.
People torn. How would you encourage them?
I mean, door number 1 isn't fun necessarily up front, right? It's easier to be angry than to grieve. and it's more fun, to be honest. And there's a lot of rewards right now out there for being angry and in taking stock of your own complicity. I mean, as David has done, and I will say, I mean, honestly, when you first invited me onto your podcast, I was like, okay, I don't know if I can trust this guy. I know things about him, and but your voice is so important because while there are many evangelicals who are saying what has happened, this is terrible, there are far fewer who are really interrogating their own complicity in that very carefully and honestly. And so I'm a Calvinist. That's my faith background. And so I'm very comfortable with human fallenness, and it's all of us. And so it's within my tradition. It's cool to say, what have I done? And I messed up again and again. I think for a lot of evangelicals, that doesn't actually come naturally, even though, as a Calvinist, I would say it's so scriptural and these are Bible-believing Christians. But there's been such an emphasis on this kind of positivity. God has blessed me. I'm a really nice person. And yes, locating the evil out there. Mm-hmm. And so it really is asking a lot of people to take a close look at their own actions and then their own hearts. And then there's outside forces, too, that are making this difficult because, you will see people, again, these kind of targeted attacks against people like you, against people like me. So if you model this, you're going to be called, a wimp, or you're going to be called, you're going to be ridiculed, mocked. And there's a lot of projection. Then you're going to be attacked. And for me, you mentioned reading the New Testament with an understanding of power. So I get a lot of criticism, really manufactured criticism from certain conservative spaces for being postmodernist, for being a deconstructionist, for all of this. And most of this is entirely made up. I can say, okay, indirectly, yes, I'm a gender historian. So Foucault is lurking in the background there, and we have an analysis of power that we're dealing with. But I've always said that I came to that as a Calvinist, right, who is religiously wired to see sin everywhere, not just in individual hearts, but in structures, in societies, and that sin is really the abuse of power, usurping God's power and disrupting shalom, right? So this is my religious angle. And yet our kind of religious posture is under attack very directly. So people are actively trying to dissuade people from even looking behind door number one.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. If you've not yet done so, subscribe today on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We do love hearing from you, and are always pleased to hear some of the things you would like to hear more about. You can email us at feedback@nosmallendeavor.com. Also, remember you can sign up for our email list, or you can find out how to join us for a live event, all again at nosmallendeavor.com. This is our interview with Kristin DeMay and David French. Coming up, we'll hear from them about the ways it seems culture is getting increasingly hostile and how they, as supposed controversial figures, deal with critique. Part 2 in just a moment. Welcome back to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Kristin DeMay and David French. Short answer, how do both of you best deal with ridicule?
When I figure that out, I'll tell you.
Honestly, I think a lot of it's really funny. It's I don't know what's wrong with me. It just very little gets to me. And I think it's here these aren't my people in the same way as they were your people, and none of these people are former friends. I didn't share in this value system in the same way. And so for me, it is not personal. For me, I first kind of observed this world as scholar and as critic, and I observed these patterns. And now that some of these patterns are, happening to me, of course, they ought to. If I got the story right, this is exactly what should happen. I should say, I shouldn't say I don't take them seriously, because when you get called the devil, this many times, every once in a while you think, ooh, let me think about this. Or when you just see the vitriol, I worry about, what is it? I'm not trying to provoke that, but I'm also not going to let it stand, right? And so there's always, I don't know if I'm sure you have this question: when do you engage? When do you ignore? When do you kind of hold up a mirror, and when do you just say that's only going to feed this? And that's a question that I have a lot of times. And I worry sometimes that when people are seeing what's coming at me, even though I personally don't feel affected by it, except for it's time consuming to monitor this, I do worry that one of the intentions, I think, is to send a signal to others that this is what's going to happen to you if you venture into this territory.
The critique is sending a signal to others. You don't want this to happen to you.
This viciousness.
Yeah.
For me, it's been very complicated, because when I have been the center of a lot of fire, it usually is also accompanied by escalating threats. So being doxxed by white nationalists, people coming by our house, very direct death threats. So for me, if there's a couple of things going on. One, if I engage on Twitter, I have a real concern that, in 2019, there was this essay written in First Things magazine called Against David Frenchism, and by Sohrab Ahmari, who was then the editorial page editor of the New York Post. And it became a thing in conservative circles. And so there's sort of got to be this kind of idea that, wait, if I can take David French down a peg or two, which is a super weird thing to say, because who am I, right? Just this guy. But triggering a fight became kind of a business model. And so I don't want to participate in that business model. I don't want to feed that. But then what ends up happening is you have just this wall of disinformation that is just flung at you. And you don't know what to do about it, because you can't, if you try to dive in and rebut it, often you're giving the liar exactly what the liar wants, which is
attention.
The attention. But if you don't rebut it, the lie still travels around. So again, I was having lunch with this SBC friend of mine, and he was just talking about the sheer number of flat out wrong things he hears about me. Yeah. And that grieves me. The idea that there's lots of people who just believe fundamentally false things about me is grievous to me. But the weird thing is the effort to address it could perversely do more harm than good.
Exactly.
Especially in a Twitter space.
Yeah.
And so that's why I said, if I've got it, once I figure it all out, I will tell you. Yeah. But I think the most hurtful thing, actually, when the threats really came rolling in 2015 and 2016 for the first time, our very close friends were very grieved with us and very hurt with us that this happened. But you move one layer out of that close friendship, and the next response was, well, don't let that turn you against Trump. And you're thinking, wait a minute, there's a human being here who's going through a really traumatic time with just a family. And whatever I've written, it's not my kid's fault,
right?
And one of your main responses is, well, I can see that's going to turn you against Trump.
Yeah.
That's not how you interact with a human being in a morally healthy way. That's when you've elevated politics to such a position that all other considerations start to fall away.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated, Kristin, with you said this at the very top, and then you just reiterated again a moment ago about taking the posture of scholarship. That is, you actually engage, when you do choose to engage, you're engaging with that sort of discipline of taking questions seriously, which means they also have to be willing to take a critique or not. Are there other inner resources, communal resources that continue to help sustain you in doing this sort of work?
So I have not had the same level of threats against my family. And so, we're really talking about two different things here. I'm talking about, Twitter threads for the most part. I've also taken a number of precautions, as any of us in these spaces do, and have a lot of boundaries. and I even, don't even want to say more about any of that because you don't want to draw things to you. So from what I've experienced, I mean, yeah, humor does, it's hard for me to take some of these things seriously, even though I know that they are serious, but particularly, and I have noticed a real difference when some of my work gets out of the more religious conservative spaces and brought over, via the Daily Wire or some other sites into a broader white nationalist space. That's when things can get ugly.
Very dark.
Exactly. Most of my engagement stays within the Christian spaces. And that's where, and much of it is coming from people with higher degrees. And so I can, the scholarship kind of works, but it feels to me very one-sided. The personal attacks come, and then I'm like, let's define our terms, shall we? But I'm a teacher at heart, so I really love that. This is what I'm here for. Let's talk historical methodology. I really enjoy that. But in terms of like kind of the resources that I draw on, I like Schitt's Creek gifts as a way of just holding up the absurdity, right?
Yeah.
The absurdity sometimes of this, and lighten up,
Right.
and kind of truth to power in these spaces. I like being a woman in these spaces that are male dominated and being able to push back. And I do that on behalf of women who can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so what strengthens me is hearing from other people. I get a lot of public support. I know you do too. I get a lot of private support.
Yeah.
And I get a lot of support from women in conservative spaces who say, we see what you're doing. Please don't stop. We can't do this ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of, support for any of the hits that I take. I get so many more, just notes of gratitude.
Yeah. So you mentioning you like being a woman in this space. Why don't both of you share with us a little bit about what are you just seeing in the last 6 months with regard to gender, sex, women, lots going on, right?
That's all you.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see. Do we want to start with abortion or should we start with trans rights or?
So much, right?
Yeah. It feels like a moving target. And I don't know if it feels this way to you. It just feels like the news cycle is speeding up just exponentially. And so, okay, today I've got to give an interview on sex abuse. And now we've got a shooting and we've got to talk about gun violence and white nationalism. And now we've got, Dobbs and protests. And now it's CRT, but that's so last year. And now we're into, the great threat of trans rights. And it's honestly dizzying just to keep up with all of it. And I think that part of this is strategy of throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And kind of testing things out. And when something gets traction, you lean into that until something else bubbles up. I'm actually really concerned about not any, yes, particular issues, but the whole constellation here and how it seems to be, well, certainly exacerbating kind of the social distrust and enhancing polarization. The stakes just keep getting raised every single day. And I worry very much about our, not just civility, but our mutual now commitment to democracy as a way of working through this. I think the escalation of rhetoric against trans people is very frightening, against the LGBTQ community in general. I think the escalating rhetoric and hardening stances, even within the pro-life movement, right, and the demonization of people who are not deemed quite sufficiently pro-life, and that line just keeps moving. I think it's deeply disturbing. I don't know where it ends, to be honest.
I agree with that. And I'd say what we're in the middle of now is, so you have a nation of 330 million people. You have basically instant access to the worst person in the world on the other side of the aisle every day, right? So you have infinity distractions that you can mount. So it's remarkable to me how quickly the story of an extraordinary record of the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee, not just burying sex abuse claims, but deeply, treating sex abuse victims just horribly. How quickly that goes away because a drag queen did something outrageous somewhere.
Yes.
And so what you have is this constant avalanche, an entire industry dedicated to putting right in front of your face the absolute most outrageous stuff you can find on the other side of the aisle. And then they'll sit there and demand, well, you say you're a conservative Christian, you're an Orthodox, small O Orthodox Christian. Why aren't you out there on this?
Yes. All the time.
Constant. It is constant like that. And of course, in a big country, you can find crazy stuff every day. I mean, if I wanted to respond, I could, for every Libs of TikTok video, there's a Patriot Takes video that's got something incredible happening in a church. And you could flop it right back at them and say, where are you on this? And so a lot of the struggle here is to be able to maintain attention on important things and screen out those things that they may be bad. I didn't like what I saw in that drag queen video. There was like 14 people there. I mean, shame on those parents for taking their kids to it. I don't like that. But okay, I'm not going to talk about the corruption in the largest Protestant denomination in the United States because of that? Really? So a lot of what I try to do is try to keep people thinking about big and important things and screening out sort of the day-to-day noise that is really driving us apart. Because if you dive down that rabbit hole, if you're somebody on the left and all you're looking at is Patriot Takes videos, you're going to think everyone on the right has lost their mind. Mm-hmm. But if you're on the right and you're watching that Libs of TikTok feed, you're going to think everyone on the left has just lost their mind, and it's exacerbating this divide and making everyone so angry all the time.
But of course, this isn't just like individual choices. This is how it's a business model. Right. For these platforms, with the decline of traditional media and local media, everything's a competition for clicks. Mm-hmm. And it's very clear which of these articles are going to get shared. And so, again, to think structurally here just a bit, it's not just that we're all making really bad choices, but the system is now rigged to reward those bad choices. And so individually, we can push back against that. I feel like now too, a disclaimer, I have not seen the video of this latest drag queen at a library, but
I don't know. I can't remember where it is.
So no comment on that.
I think it's at an actual drag club that parents brought some kids to.
All right. So yes, no comment because I haven't seen it because I can't keep up with all of the outrageous things or not outrageous. I don't know. No comment. But it's hard individually to push back against this. I kind of have my own policies and practices. I try to never share things for the sake of outrage. Mm-hmm. Now, every once in a while, I will share some really goofy things if it's a very on-brand Jesus and John Wayne thing, right? I kind of have a collection. I curate this, and people send them to me, and so exception there. But that's holding it up with a bit of levity, not just outrage. I really try to, in my social media presence, always bring something to the table from my research to ideally elevate the conversation, and then also the Schitt's Creek gifts or, anything else. But to try to not just stoke outrage. And so there are many things I don't comment on, many fights I sit out. And I'm quite careful about what I comment on and how, and what I bring to the table.
I really try to avoid nut picking, which is the business model of a lot of social media. So nut picking is when you take somebody who is a fringe character on the other side of the political spectrum and elevate them as emblematic. So, this is the whole Libs of TikTok versus, like Patriot Takes thing, where somebody takes somebody who's on the far, far fringe and says, see, this is what they're like. So for me, before I'm going to write about something or comment about something, it has to cross a threshold of importance. Mm-hmm. So if I hear that there was some event at some church somewhere where someone shouted out to hang the Secretary of State of the state I'm not as interested in that when I find out that there are, major elected officials were there, or, oh, it was thousands of people there, or, oh, and also there is a Reawaken America tour going on where Michael Flynn, who called for martial law, is packing churches from coast to coast.
Yep.
And it's sponsored by Charisma Magazine.
Yes.
Then you're like, that's important enough to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to really screen, okay, what's the fringe thing that's just going to contribute to this endless churn of outrage versus what's the important thing that we actually need to focus on and be alarmed about.
Let me ask you to end with, in the middle of all of this, what appears to be a lot of disintegration, increasing polarization, what's something of late you've seen that you thought, yeah, we could use more of that?
Oh, now you're bringing out the hard question.
I am pessimistic about where we're headed, but with seeds of optimism, because the seeds of renewal are sort of being sown. I don't know if they're going to flower, but the seeds are being sown. And the seeds I think you're seeing, and this is actually something that's measurable, is that this toxic polarization is being driven by a minority of Americans. This group called More in Common did a Hidden Tribes survey of American life and found that polarization on right and left is being driven by a demographically very similar cohort of people: disproportionately white, disproportionately wealthy, disproportionately well-educated, and disproportionately likely to view politics as a hobby. And they're the ones just yanking us apart. In other words, we're talking about the demographic cohort of one of the most powerful and privileged demographic cohorts in the history of the world is got this constant feeling that they're 6 minutes from midnight, which doesn't make any sense. But what they said, what the Hidden Tribe survey said, is there's an exhausted majority. Now, this exhausted majority is not all moderate. It's not the moderate middle. It's people on the right, people on the left, and people in the middle who know we can do better. But they're exhausted. Yeah. They've pulled away. And so the way I've put it is, the longer the operative word of exhausted majority is exhausted, then the worse off we are. The more the operative word becomes majority, the better off we'll be. Because it is really, truly the case that a lot of all these dynamics are being driven by an extremely motivated minority.
So the importance of not drawing away out of exhaustion.
Yes.
But choosing to re-engage with some sanity about wherever you're coming from.
Yes. And people flock to it.
Yeah.
People flock to it. One thing I say to put or affirmation, something that Kristin said, there is a giant difference between my Twitter replies and my inbox. The people who reach out to me privately it's some of the most encouraging, touching, moving stuff that I've ever read about the gratitude that that not everyone is leaning out, the hope that they gain from, this idea that not everyone is diving into this polarization. It's really meaningful. It's really meaningful.
Same, absolutely the same. I went into my office yesterday at work, and I don't always remember to check my mailbox. And I have been giving a lot of interviews the last couple of weeks, and so my box was just overflowing with letters. And I was like, okay, brace myself. What if I talked about abortion? I talked about white Christian nationalism. I talked about gun violence, and what's okay. Let's start opening these, and one after another, they were words of gratitude. And I also have received hundreds, we're probably at thousands now, of letters in the last 2 years from people. Most emails and not actual letters. But that exhaustion, it worries me because there was a lot of energy in 2016, right? On both sides, but on kind of the David French types, right? The, hey guys, no, this isn't what we mean. This isn't who we are. But it wasn't enough. And then you have Black Lives Matter movement, right? You had protesters against Trump on immigration. You had all of this, but here we are 5 years later. So it's not working. So is it worth showing up anymore? Is it worth, I don't know. But I also find great encouragement in people doing the hard work. And so on social media, what that looks like is not the zinger back at this endless cycle of zingers. It's people jumping in, people I don't even know, ordinary folks, some with college degrees, some not, just taking on, and trying to set the record straight. No, let me explain this. No, I don't think this is right. And taking the heat and just patiently reasoning. And I watch those folks. I usually quietly follow them. And sometimes I don't jump in and like things because I feel like that could escalate. Oh, Kristin Dumais on here now, but I watch that and I'm so appreciative of that quiet, good work. And so I love that framing of the exhausted majority. I tend to focus on the exhaustion, but you're right. We're talking the majority. So what can be done to draw ourselves together?
Talking to David French, Kristin Dumais, thank you both for your time, but more, thank you for your continued good faith and good work in the world and your being with us today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. If you'd like to hear more from Kristin and David, check out our previous episodes with each of David and Kristin individually. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you've got feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Email us, text, or attach a voice memo, and send to the address feedback@nosmallendeavor.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg of Bragg Management, executive producer Jacob Lewis of our very own Great Feeling Studios, associate producers Ashley Bain and Tom Anderson, music director Tim Lauer, engineer Carrie Harmon, music beds by Zach and Maggie White and Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening. I'm Lee C. Camp. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Hey, it's Andrew again. We hope you enjoyed this episode from the podcast No Small Endeavor. If you'd like to hear more from them, new episodes are released weekly on Thursdays.
You can follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.